Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining the second session of our seminar series, Forms, Fragments, and Fractures in Contemporary Women's Writing, Spain, Portugal, and Italy. Today, we are focusing on the post-war period when Hani and I thought that the similarities among Spain, Portugal, and Italy were particularly striking. The connections that emerged for women's writing in general and women's life writing in particular during this moment could have been the subject of an entire series. Consider, for example, the connections that arise from experiences of persecution, exile, or dictatorship. One particularly profound link that comes to my mind is between Elsa Morante and the Zambrano sisters, especially through Araceli, Elsa Morante's final novel. Another relevant topic that we could be for sure addressing is the ongoing research on women's testimonies of their experience in the prisons of the Estado Novo in Portugal and Francoist Spain. In this regard, I'd like to highlight the work of my colleague Cristina Somolinos at the University of Alcalá. She has edited a special issue of the Iberoamericana titled Literaturas y Contextos Carcelarios, Escrituras y Representaciones en la Península Ibérica, Literature and Prison, Writings and Representation in the Peninsula. And we hope that these three papers that we are presenting today will further this research, this ongoing research on the connections among these countries during the post-war period. I would like to ask everyone in the audience again to please mute their microphones. And I also want to remind you that the session is being recorded. After the presentations, we will have Q&A sessions where you can ask your questions, and we will be very grateful to receive questions and to further our discussion. And you can present your questions either through the chat or through video. Just keep in mind that the session is being recorded. And without further ado, I pass it over to Hani.
Thanks so much, Raquel, and thank you so much, everyone, for being here today. We have another brilliant lineup of speakers, and I'm really excited to be introducing not one, not two, but three lovely colleagues and friends today. And we'll follow the same format as last time, so we'll have our three papers, and then, as Raquel said, the Q&A at the end. So our first speaker today is Cláudia Pazos Alonso, my wonderful colleague in Portuguese here in Oxford. And Cláudia is Professor of Portuguese and Gender Studies and Senior Research Fellow at the University of Oxford. Her research interests centre on women's writing, gender representations in the public sphere, and the role of literature in the formation of national and post-colonial identities. She's published prolifically and has co-written major textbooks, A Companion to Portuguese Literature, as well as Reading Literature in Portuguese, and she is the author of 3 monographs on the work of early 20th century poet Flor Bela Espanca, on Portuguese women's writing across the 20th century, and co-authored with Professor Louis Owen, and on bilingual journalist and writer Francisco Wood. Her current project, or one of her current projects, turns to the Black Atlantic, exploring how key works from Brazil, the Cape Verde Islands, and Portugal deal with the trauma of slavery. And her paper today is entitled Life Writing as Funambulism During the Portuguese Dictatorship. Thank you so much for being here, Cláudia, and over to you.
Okay, right. This is the moment where I'm going to try and share and hope it's going to work. So, okay. Can you see it?
Yes.
Yeah, we can just have it on full, slideshow mode.
And now I can put it from the beginning. Hooray! You can see it, yes?
Thanks, Cláudia.
Okay, that was really rather silly of me to call anything funambulism because I can't pronounce the word. Anyway, thank you so much for this opportunity. It's wonderful to have a chance to explore new authors. I haven't written on Natalia Nunes previously, and to do so in a context where we're looking at 3 Southern European countries is just something I had been wanting to do for a long time. So thank you very much to Raquel and Hani for the opportunity. So the principal thesis of this short presentation is that women writing during the dictatorship had to perform a balancing act. And here I'm drawing on a paper last year by my colleague in Barcelona, Elena Soler Losada, who used the word funambulism, which we can define as a precarious equilibrium, with always the danger of falling flat on your face. So it's dangerous, potentially lethal. And at the same time, there's an idea of movement, so it's not static. Ultimately, it's a case of mind over matter, where you have to concentrate, recenter yourself, irrespective of your circumstances. And it's clearly a very skilled performance. So to me, it helps to understand women's writing in very adverse circumstances. The pioneer in terms of experiments in life writing in a Portuguese context is Irene Lisboa. And we've got a chapter, Hilary and I, in Antigone's Daughters about her writing. You have a series of significant titles. Dia e Outro Dia, Diário de uma Mulher. Solidão, Notas do Punho de uma Mulher. Começa uma Vida. All these works are signed under a male pseudonym, João Falco. And the importance of that is that she nonetheless, paradoxically, incorporates uma mulher in the subtitle. So you've got an anonymity, uma mulher, not Irene Lisboa, uma mulher who is in fact João Falco. Essentially, you've got a case of funambulism because her voice only comes into the public domain through the embodiment in a male persona. Furthermore, in terms of genre, these works are also pioneer in their textual hybridity. Her debut collection is subtitled A Diário, whereas the diary is not a diário, but just the notas penned by a woman. Começa uma Vida, the autofictional novella, is a little bit more straightforward in that sense. But this strategic blurring of boundaries, of generic boundaries, is something that's going to be carried over into another genre, the genre of travel accounts, which is what I want to talk about today. And essentially arguing, following Susan Bassner's lead, that female travelers have written self-reflexive texts that defy easy categorization as autobiography, memoir, or travel account. These, only a handful really, have been published. And the most well-known ones are the ones by Natalia Correia, by Ilse Loza, and by Maria Ondina Braga. Those have been republished. The one that hasn't been published is the one I'm going to deal with today, Natalia Nunes, uma portuguesa em Paris, Notas de Viagem, only published as an author's edition and not available because it hasn't been reprinted. What do we know about Natalia Nunes? She was a prolific writer who wrote into the 21st century. Uma Portuguesa em Paris comes at the beginning of her trajectory, and the autofiction dimension of her work is already clear in the Memórias and the Autobiographies, which is in fact a novel. I believe she was in dialogue with Irene Lisboa. In in both cases, we've got two women who, and I'm quoting Shonda Rhimes, limit their accounts to fragments of their lives with an emphasis on childhood in order to avoid too much disclosure. And this happens in Começa uma Vida and in Horas Vivas, which actually was reviewed by Lisboa. So that's a nice touch. Now, was she a jeune fille rangée or was she a rebellious woman? She'd like to think of herself as rebellious, and indeed tells us that when she got married in light green and only the accessories were white. But she is rebellious, and certainly in the 1960s, there's evidence of that in her membership of the Sociedade Portuguesa de Escritores, which was closed down by Pete for awarding the prize to a black writer amidst the colonial wars. And she was also a contributor to a book on women's status in Portugal at the time. From an early point, her memoirs are quite different, in fact, to Irene Lisboa, because she embraces life. There's much more of a lust for life. And the quotation I bring you today shows that. It's from her Horas Vivas. Apetecia-me ir para campo muito vazio e correr à doida, toda nua, debaixo do sol. In her novel Regresso ao Caos, Return to Chaos, the self-exposure is even more evident in the female protagonist, Matilde, who decides to do a self-portrait, a nude self-portrait. This is the reaction of her brother, Gonçalo. Sim, eu gosto, mas o público, os homens hão de ver apenas a nudez, a tua nudez, e as mulheres chamar-te-ão desenvergonhada. The novel was written over 2 years, in 56 to 58, so shortly after the publication of her travel account, but according to Gaspar Simões, it was turned down by publishers. It was eventually self-published 2 years later, and like her travel account, has yet to be republished. So the more daring you are, the more in trouble you get. Just in between the memoirs and the Regresso ao Caos, we've got Uma Portuguesa em Paris, Notas de Viagem. And I believe the dangers of disclosure become quite interesting. And that's what I'm going to try and analyze. I think that's why Nunes probably framed her account as a travelogue rather than a diary. It's a kind of way of bypassing the obvious self-disclosure. And it's nonetheless, because it was self-published, it's hardly known, this text. I haven't really found much criticism on it. As Teresa Sousa de Almeida highlights, it's almost unknown. Texto em que se descobre o ambiente do pós-guerra na capital francesa, sublinhando-se as diferenças culturais que existem face a Portugal parado no tempo. But that Portugal frozen in time and the criticism of it is only really the tip of the iceberg, as I hope to show through the analysis of a couple of episodes. First, though, I'd like to say something about her navigating the social expectations of her time. As is well known, the 1933 Constitution proclaimed all Portuguese citizens equal before the law, except women, because of the differences inherent in their nature and in the interest of the family. Indeed, by law, Natalia Nunes was required to have her husband's permission in order to travel. So what we have got is an unconventional married mother. She's already a published author, and she leaves her family behind to spend 6 weeks in Paris alone. For what one assumes to be the sake of propriety, she stays in a convent, de foyer. She actually gives her reasoning behind it. She says she stayed there por economia, por medo desconhecido e também porque ainda não sou uma pessoa livre. I love this bracketed comment, this recognition that actually she was too fearful to strike out on her own. Nonetheless, her self-portrait is not as a wife and mother. In fact, she went to Paris for professional reasons. She had an internship as a librarian, supported by a scholarship from the French government. But she doesn't mention so until halfway through the diary. And she leaves any mentions of her family behind after the first page. She mentions her mother and her daughter in the first page, her husband not at all, and then she really is striking out into this new city and embracing the experience. Moreover, we also find out that she got to spend 10 days of, in inverted commas, guilty pleasure, enjoying her cultural immersion, free from family obligations. Except, and I think this is really striking, she's unapologetic. So I think there's an issue of censorship, clearly, but there's also an issue of self-censorship. What is it that she cannot say too openly? So the regime is only a layer, as are literary critics, but the issue, I think, is the circle of friends and family, and also herself. So that self-censorship becomes a preemptive mechanism against the risk. So there's various levels of risk. And the first one that we see is the low-risk self-disclosure, which is about outings. Paris is the city of the flaneur par excellence, but immediately what we find out is that as a woman, she risks harassment on the streets. So a lot of the time she's actually spending in public buildings, in museums, in monuments, seeing plays, films, as well as in meals and cafes. Gives her some protection. And she socializes with other women, so she's not entirely on her own. Where things become a little bit blurred is that she also socializes with men. A university colleague, Urbano Tavares Rodrigues, with whom she has dinner, but also a Swiss-German librarian, Fritz, that she met on her internship. And he even takes her out on her motorbike in the same decade with that iconic images of Audrey Hepburn. So I love this idea. But then there's other more challenging disclosures. And one of them is, of course, dreams. And her biggest diary entry is actually an account of 3 dreams, which I think is a roundabout way to foreground desire and sexuality. In fact, she starts with a dream about friction and ignition, and immediately alludes to Freud. O elemento sexual é uma constante S de valor conhecido. And then moves on to her main dream, where she reveals herself to be free-floating, a symbol of innermost desires and freedom. And I will look at a quotation next. It's a very long dream. She is in uma espécie de oceano cósmico. She is poisada no fundo dessa metade redonda e líquida. And suddenly has a revelation of the totalidade do universo, olhando para cima. Foi como se there would be another half of the ocean, and together se formasse oceano único, esférico, completo. Então, desprendi-me do fundo e flutuei exatamente no centro desse universo, numa felicidade perfeita. In short, and without going into dream analysis, we have got an environment that offers the opportunity for expanded horizons, recreation, not just in the sense of entertainment, but of creating again, and rebirth. A second moment I want to analyze is her comments on race. She describes, for instance, the Boulevard Saint-Michel and all the different minglings of races in a way that nonetheless is shaped by essentialist comments. what we have got to see is beyond that, because the first impression is, oh, this is very dated, but actually it's not. She's got to be quite careful, especially, at a time when Lusotropicalism was the main ideology of race in Portugal. And therefore, what she gives is a French context, which was far more advanced in terms of anti-colonial politics. Indeed, she says that she meets two black men from Senegal, and that they talk to her about o grande projeto da independência dos negros da Guiné Francesa. So yes, you've got essentialist comments, but you also have the anti-colonial politics. But the highest stake disclosure comes towards the end of her diary, when she spends an evening at a dancing party at the Maison de Tunisie. And I think we'd do well to remind ourselves that actually Tunisia was one of the early French colonies to become independent, the same year that her diary was published. And her presence there, her mere presence there, signifies her breaking away from internalized structures, as socializing with black men would be a no-no in Portugal. She does describe the men in essentialist terms. They are frenéticos de vida e instinto. They are like jungle animals, but they're also attractive. Quente e penetrante. And the evening culminates with a transcription in French and in italics of the words of one of her acquaintances, who describes sharing a kiss with a black man. And again, I want to read this out. I'm afraid this one's in French. Il m'a donné un baiser avec ses lèvres aussi douces que le plumage d'un oiseau. Mais voilà, Nathalie, ce qui est étrange. En même temps, j'ai eu le sentiment d'avoir été touchée par le corps moelleux et flaccide d'un ver. Et alors, un petit frisson d'aurore m'a parcouru tout entière. Et pourtant, elle s'en alla avec le noir. So, the friend is French and is talking French, but the caption is also in French, and that's her comments. What we have got is a displacement of contradictory behavior and disregard for racial boundaries projected onto her acquaintance. There's an attempt at containment by using French, but the episode is not suppressed. This is about transgressive bodily desire and racial intimacy. Now, here I'm going to start my conclusions. Natalia Nun's diary is made up of fleeting impressions, vignettes of characters, dreams, reflections, and the fragmented form facilitates the wandering thoughts. Her mobility promotes freedom, both physical and psychological, and the diary offers a kind of safe space for her to step out gradually out of her comfort zone. It enables her to reconnect with her sense of adventure and embrace the right to an almost voyeuristic female gaze at times. Although the notas de viagem apparently were candid self-exposure, she was always aware that she was walking a tightrope. So is she a successful funambulist in 1950s Portugal? Is it a case of mind over matter, i.e., if she throws caution away to the wind, she'll be fine? Well, with the regime, I think she kind of knew she was okay. She framed her diary as travel notes. It was a risk. To literary critics, well, not anyone much paid attention to her self-publishing in a minor genre. Circle of friends and family, she actually leaves them behind pretty unapologetically. I think it's her way of dealing with it. You know, what happens in Paris stays in Paris. So ultimately, in that sense, it's quite a skilled performance. I think the more difficult one is herself. What is she prepared to acknowledge to herself? There's an early recognition that ainda não sou uma pessoa livre. And what I think is happening in this diary is that she's gradually lowering her defenses about the need to police thoughts and behavior. There are telling tales of self-censorship, but arguably she returns home as a more liberated woman. And just one last slide. I think that for many Portuguese women writers, especially looking ahead to 1960s and 70s, Paris was a place of liberation. And I think in that sense, Natalia Nunes is an early example of textualizing the feeling of liberation through this admirable dream and beautiful alliteration. And I will read it once more. Desprendi-me do fundo e flutuei exatamente no centro desse universo, numa felicidade perfeita. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cláudia. What a fantastic start to this session. The idea of funambulism, I thought you elaborated beautifully, and I think it will go on to be quite an important framework for several other papers in this series. In fact, I feel like your work spoke beautifully already to Ursula and to Jean's papers from last week. So thank you so much for that. So on to our second speaker. So we're delighted to welcome Mara Josi, who is a wonderful friend and colleague from UCD, University College Dublin. And so Mara is assistant professor in Italian at UCD. She completed her PhD at the University of Cambridge, and she held postdoctoral positions at UCD and at Ghent University, as well as a lectureship at the University of Manchester. Mara's work reflects her interest in innovative research methodologies and cultural approaches to the study of literature. She sets up interdisciplinary frameworks which merge notions of Holocaust and cultural memory studies with literary and trauma theory. Her first book, Rome, 16th October 1943, History, Memory, Literature, was awarded the Premio Internazionale in Euflania per l'Italianistica. It's absolutely fantastic. I would thoroughly recommend it to everyone. And Mara will be speaking today. Her paper's entitled Multifaceted, Fractured and Torn Selves, Autobiographies of Lives in Hiding During the German Occupation of Italy. Thank you very much, Mara, and over to you.
Well, I think I have to unmute myself first and then try to share my screen. And thank you very much, Raquel and Hani, for having me here. So just a second to be sure. Okay, can you hear me and see the PowerPoint? That's brilliant. So again, thank you very much for having me here, for the generous introduction. And I will start without further ado. So today I would like to consider further the idea of provocativeness that was introduced by Ursula Fanning last week in relation to Sibilla Le Ramos, Una Donna. So Ursula, I think, very compellingly pointed out how much this work was provocative in terms of the plot, the representation of the female body and feelings, and in terms of the form. Now, today, I would like to investigate further the concept of provocativeness, which some texts reporting the experience of persecution in occupied Italy convey in a very subtle way. So the provocativeness of these texts written by Italian Jewish authors reside in the non-adherence to social expectation and also in the denouncement of an active role of Italian citizens in the process of discrimination against Jews and above all persecution, of course, thus defining the contours of an Italian Holocaust and deepening the multifaceted physiognomy of Holocaust survivors in Italy. Now, my suggestion is to consider Holocaust-related experiences faced outside concentration and extermination camps and set instead in Italy, more specifically in the domestic place, be it the one which will be later abandoned or the fortuitous dwelling longed for, while also looking at home-related dynamics, which of course play a very central role in the reconstruction of identity. So, in other words, today I'd like to reason on Holocaust literature by looking at it from a marginalized perspective, from the marginalized perspective of domesticity, which is understood as the domestic place, family life, and familial relationship, and more generally exploring how Holocaust-related traumas are traceable in home-related images. So example will be drawn from texts which explore the traumatic experience of abandoning one's home, adapting to alternative domesticities, and returning to one's own place. And shedding light on the literary narratives documenting the experience. This experience not only deepens our understanding of Holocaust-related experiences, which are specifically linked to the domestic place, but also, I think, provide valuable insight into how the self is presented in literature after undergoing the profound disruption of assuming multiple identities to evade deportation into the camps, be it concentration or extermination. Now, according to Victoria Rosner, between World War I and World War II, there was a change in the meaning of home, which was reimagined and rediscovered. Well, according to Rosner, there is a relationship between modernism and the modernization of 20th century home. So in other words, the transformation of modernity is central to the development of a modernist aesthetic. That is to say, minimal writing, functionalism, simplicity, and rationalization, according to Rosner. Well, what I wonder is whether we can perceive on a structural level, apart from a content level, of course, the fragmentation of the self in the process of reconstructing identity while and after enduring home-related traumas and experiencing profound disruption of assuming multiple identities to evade deportation. So very, very briefly, I promise, the idea of home overlaps with that of a place of origin, of a current domicile, of a personal sense of belonging. Home is clearly not only a place, but also consists of social interaction and identity construction. So there is an emotional, imaginative, symbolic, and also relational dimension of home. But home as a noun conveys a limited meaning. So scholars have variously wondered whether it could be more accurate to use it as a verb, that is, homing, to portray the more complex and more nuanced and more existential meaning of home. So homing, to name the need and the struggle for a place to be called home. The influence of a home-related values, aspirations, and ideas on the self. So in other words, homing to refer to the tension between the experienced sense of home and the aspired one, and that tension of the self to bridge these two. And it is in this tension that I locate the fractured self of the narrating I, while portraying the torn narrated I in the disruptive experience of the fall of the orderly, we might try to call it that way, the fall of the orderly world, as well as of finding a fortuitous dwelling where to hide and constructing and living with a fictitious, fabricated, and false identity. So this paper analyzes 3 autobiographical texts by Italian Jewish women recounting their experience of hiding. These narratives are marked by fragmentation. This means that the self is fractured, the narrated I is torn, the narrating I is multifaceted, and the fragmentation is expressed in the domestic realm, understood as a physical place, of course, but also familial and emotional bonds, and in the shift of social and familial norms, which clearly disorients the authors. The first part of this paper explore the collapse of protection and security traditionally and unconsciously, precisely in this period associated with family life. The second part consider the experience of identity change. That means adopting a new name, living in new homes, interacting with new people or with people, but in different ways, as we will see, and the resulting transformation of the self. So it therefore implicitly consider the challenges of reconstructing a home-like environment in temporary dwellings, while of course adapting to unfamiliar life, as well as confronting with their own Jewish identity, if you see what I mean. And the final part focuses on the experience of homecoming and how Holocaust-related traumas resurfaces within the domestic place once the war is over. So despite the variation in the author's experience and the genre adopted, it is above all among those texts written by authors who were children during the period of discrimination and persecution that we find similar descriptions of home-related traumas and exploration of new habits and rituals which shape identitarian traits. So the authors delve into psychological wounds stemming from the collapse of the orderly world, which is traceable in the change of the so far known family life and family places. There is the loss of protection and security when the generational barriers collapse, as we will see in a second. Children and authors appears as disoriented when adults do not filter their answer anymore and share their concerns, doubts, anxiety about the precariousness of the social-political situation. So the first set of quotation comes from Lia Levy's autobiographical book, Una bambina e basta. English translation are in blue. I'm going to read Italian ones. Mamma, perché non mi svegli? Perché non mi aiuti spiegandomi che ora va tutto a posto? Io ti guardo fissa, ma tu hai dimenticato e devi darmi qualcuno di quei cenni tranquillizzanti a cui mi hai abituato. Non è giusto, non puoi cambiarmi così in un'ora il profilo del mondo. So, her orderly word really falls when she realizes that her parents, her mother in this specific case, feels disoriented and don't know how to protect her anymore. So in this text, the interchange between the narrating I and the narrated I is not explicit, is actually extremely rare. The story is mostly narrated in a present tense, as if the events are unraveling while we are reading the book, and the narrating I is basically kept silent. The narrative unfolds through the perception of the narrated I. So we as reader do not have an overview of the story as a whole because we can only follow what little by little the narrated I lives. And yet there are some exemptions. Again, I'm quoting. Ma come, mamma? Tu mi avevi detto che a Roma c'è il Papa e che per questo noi potevamo stare tutti tranquilli, che a Roma, dopo l'oro, niente di male sarebbe successo per gli ebrei. Allora voi non sapevate niente, non potevate niente. Allora non era vero. Voi non eravate l'angelo del Signore che ci protegge con la sua spada di fuoco. Nelle vostre mani non c'era niente, solo qualche speranzosa misera bugia. Non riesco a emergere perché nessun braccio di adulto, né ora né mai, più potrà aiutarmi a farlo. And also, papà è disoccupato e questo vuol dire che non esce più la mattina per andare in ufficio. Io non lo so ora che lui pensa al suicidio. Certo, un uomo grande che non sa più cosa fare delle sue mani. Me lo ha detto mia madre tanto tempo dopo. So these bits in bold show a shift in the narrative perspective and give us an idea of two flows of time. So a present in which the story unfolds and another present, though, the one that from which the narrating I is writing and where the traumas from the past resurfaces. Similarly, scene of domestic house and alternation between points of view of the narrated I and narrating I also appear in passages reporting the hurried departures from home of the necessitated because there was a swift advance of the Nazi forces. So the narrating I intervenes, revealing the abrupt disruption of the everyday life and the traumatic experience of leaving behind familiar surrounding and beloved ones. As explicitly here pointed out in first Giacomo Alimentani's memoir In contumacia, and later we will see Stella Bonaffi Menuzzi, La Palma delle Streghe. And I'm quoting, non c'è sollievo nel pericolo, Carlo è morto, lo trasportiamo di notte in moschetto. Non diciamo niente, neanche pregare è possibile. Forse è morto perché lo abbiamo toccato, un ferito non andrebbe trascinato. Ma non potevamo fare altrimenti, rimaniamo col dubbio di averlo ucciso noi. Andrea mi viene vicino, non voglio sparare, non voglio ammazzare, non voglio vedere i morti, non voglio combattere, non voglio continuare a essere coinvolta nella violenza. Ho ancora nelle mani l'odore del sangue di Carlo. And later, all'alba ci hanno fatto vestire, siamo scappati nelle solite baite, eravamo in 9 perché mio padre era partito quasi subito, and so on and so forth. Noi credevamo di stare zitti per qualche ora. Invece la cosa è durata parecchi giorni. Per una sola ora di anticipo su di loro ci eravamo salvati dalla deportazione. So in both these examples, the intervention of the narrating I complicates the linear and sequential understanding of time of the plot and unveil the ambivalence and the interdependence between different temporal scales that underpin their personal experience of persecution in the domestic sphere. And the loss of a secure and orderly word during childhood clearly shape the sense of safety and belonging later on. So the domestic place no longer offer a sense of protection, and this pervasive fear of being hunted really persists even when the confines of even within the confines of one's home, and above all, even after the liberation. So what remains is really this sense of vulnerability to violation and displacement. L'occulta permanenza in me di tutto quello che avevo vissuto in modo persecutorio sin dalla mia prima infanzia, concernente il mondo familiare degli affetti, tuttora non mi dà requie. And again, ieri notte, dottoressa, ho sognato 2 nazisti che mi inseguivano per un sentiero di montagna. Io ero bambina. Right, and I'm jumping here, leaving you with these 2 very short quotation to the second section. The literature of hiding is really rich of references to both successful and unsuccessful attempts at creating alternative domesticities in temporary dwellings. The narrative explores the process of adapting to new places and identities while adhering to certain rules, pretending to be someone else, destroying objects that could reveal, of course, the true identities of their owners. And I am quoting, signorina zia, cavolo di rapa, quante volte ti ho detto che dovete chiamarmi zia? La signorina, cioè la zia, è molto arrabbiata con noi, come se fosse facile. È stato molto più semplice perdere l'abitudine di fare il bagno tutte le sere, di dormire sui materassi di lana, ma da un giorno all'altro dare del tu alla nostra istitutrice e chiamarla anche zia. E ricordatevi, bambini, che il nostro cognome è Ferrari. Ferrari, capito? Ferrari è più facile da ricordare che zia, perché abbiamo passato tutta una notte a scriverlo sui quaderni di scuola, dove c'era scritto Polaffi, lo abbiamo cancellato e abbiamo buttato via le etichette dei vestiti e fazzoletti che avevano le nostre cifre ricamate. So here the self is clearly portrayed in the moment of reconstruction, right, which happens in the fortuitous dwelling and which create a sort of alienation and re-evaluation of what is happening and the changes from the previous life. And this sense of inadequacy due to different social norms and values in the alternative domesticities of the fortuitous dwelling, I think is even more pervasive above those children who hid in convents and started reading on their understanding of their Jewish identity and the relationship with Catholicism, thus implicitly revealing identitarian concerns. And I'm quoting, fai un fioretto, dicevano. Rinunciavo a un polveroso dolcetto, rinunciavo ad alzarmi a correre via quando avevo finito i compiti, rinunciavo a farmi dare dalla suora quella porzione d'acqua calda che ci portavano la mattina. Fingevo di conoscere il senso di questi ottusi sacrifici, ma in verità sentivo chiaro che era il mio modo di assaggiare il frutto zuccherino di quella religione, che era lì pronta ad avvolgermi come compiacente caldo mantello. And also, la fame è un'idea fissa. Suor Maria porta un piatto coperto da un tovagliolo. Il piatto è davanti a me. E tu credi? Non hai più dubbi? Credo. Brava, ti sei salvata. La soddisfazione di Suor Maria è afona. La fame urla. Ho il mio panino imbattito. Intanto a Roma, Rabbi Panzieri, vecchio e quasi cieco, con i tefillin legati al braccio, i tallet nascosti sotto la giacca, mette in salvo i serafin dal tempio occupato e sconsacrato. Va di casa in casa, di convento in convento, trova rifugio a chi non ne ha, cerca gli ebrei nascosti e li tiene in contatto fra di loro, procura notizie a chi non ne ha, porta medicinale ai malati, pane a chi ha fame. So less explicitly here, the re-elaboration of the experience of life in convents, there is the abrupt, as you can see, passage from the narrating eye point of view, which transmit inner turmoil of the self in the past as well as in the present. And I'm reaching my third section, the oncoming. So in the corpus of texts that I analyze and through which I actually established this new category of Holocaust writing, which I call the literature of hiding, there are two major positions. Holocaust-related traumas are either explicitly commented on by the intervention of the narrating eye, as we will see, or implicitly transmitted through domestic objects. So it could be the narrating eye who explicitly enduring effects of traumatic experience lived in the past. So la dura esperienza del volso, la minaccia sempre incombente di vivere catturati dai nazifascisti, i tanti cambiamenti in stile di vita della mia infanzia mi avevano forgiato il carattere. And again, parte qualche parentesi serena, di solito mi sentivo triste e sconfortata, certe volte anche confusa, perché di notte dormivo poco e in modo agitato. Mi sembrava di sentire strani rumori e mi alzavo, ma non c'era nessuno. So, traumas from the period of persecution manifest in the present as well. So, in these cases, we really see past and present interlacing. Now, trauma can also be implicitly portrayed through objects. So the radio, I think, is a very good example. It is the embodiment of racial discrimination. It is what signed the end also of Rome's occupation, in this case, of discrimination and persecution, and also the return of a sort of normal life. And I'm quoting, ecco, siamo nella nostra casa, striminzita e rappezzata, nella penombra soffice e calda. Quando c'è la corrente elettrica ascoltiamo tutti la radio. And in Levy's work, it is through the decision to send a letter to a radio program that the child begins to articulate her identity concerns. Cara radio, comincia la letterina, sono una bambina ebrea. Mia madre legge con un gesto e con un gran gesto, come di teatro, comincia a strappare il foglio scritto in pezzi sempre più piccoli. La guardo sbalordita. Che grande errore ci può mai essere? La guardo irosa e offesa. Anche mamma mi guarda, ma con una specie di ilare indulgenza. Non sei una bambina ebrea, hai capito? Hai capito? Sei una bambina e basta. Una bambina e basta. So after a period of being perceived as the other, the child finds herself in a new reality where she's no longer marked as such. So with the war over, she is no longer a Jewish child in the eyes of other people, but she is simply a child. And it is through the repetition of just a little girl, una bambina e basta, that the author, I think, powerfully transmitted the results of insidious micro-traumas coming from the era of segregation due to discrimination and persecution among the youngest. So the belief of a difference between Jews and non-Jews, which will, of course, have taken time to dissolve. And I'm reaching now my conclusion. This text discussed today offer, of course, a very partial but telling, I think, understanding of the experience of persecution on the Italian peninsula. So a broader approach to the literature of hiding show Holocaust-related traumas of living under threat of deportation and these constant attempts at evading deportation by locating places to hide, establishing a network of people to survive, finding food, navigating lack of information, enduring isolation, segregation, fear of discovery, solitude, as well as, of course, also joining anti-fascist movement, writing in underground newspaper and circulating them. Now, for most of Italian Jews, actually the 81% of Italian Jews, this was the Holocaust experience. And I think it's worth being studied, recollected and discussed in its own right, because, well, it expands the discourse around the Holocaust in the country and well beyond its border. So addressing the literature of hiding really help us not only to look at something that has been overlooked and under-investigated, a widespread, though, form of testimony from this period of persecution and discrimination, but also without addressing the literature of hiding, we are also failing to expand the discourse on the fractured self by missing the opportunity to further deepen the discussion on identity and selfhood in the second half of 20th century. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Mara. That was a beautifully developed comparison. And I think your idea of a literature of hiding is so important, not only with respect to the text you work on, but with respect to how we receive life writing more broadly as a space, our expectations of revelation that are so cleverly subverted in the text. But you're talking about, Cláudia was talking about, and our papers last week. So thank you very much. So we'll move on now to our final speaker, and I'm so honoured to be introducing my brilliant co-convener, Raquel Fernández Menéndez. So Raquel's work is as impressive in its depth as it is in its breadth, and her knowledge of Spanish women's writing never fails to impress me. I have learned so much from her through our collaboration, so a huge thank you, Raquel, for that. So Raquel is lecturer in literary theory and comparative literature at the University of Salamanca. Her current project focuses on the diary form, on the diary, so through an approach that combines the theory of emotions and the history of literary genres. She holds a PhD in literature and gender studies from the University of Oviedo, and she's been a visiting researcher here at the University of Oxford, the Université Sorbonne Nouvelle, the CCHSC SIC in Madrid, in Spain, and the University of Utrecht in the Netherlands, where she's also taught courses on Spanish literature and culture. Before joining the University of Salamanca, she was a Juan de la Cierva postdoctoral fellow at the University of Alcalá, and she also held a postdoctoral fellowship from the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation at the University of Pazos. She is the author, so another one for everyone's reading list, of a really fantastic book, Lecturas Firmadas, Antologías Poéticas y Discursos de Género en la España Franquista. And today she'll be talking about Rosa Chacel, and her paper is entitled The Ethics of Diary Keeping, Narcissism and Vulnerability in Rosa Chacel's Alcancía. Thank you, Raquel, and over to you.
Thank you, Hani. Thank you very much for your kind words. Thank you for our collaboration, and thank you for making this possible, and to give light to our work every day, which is very hard, and these connections make it easier. I'm very honored to be sharing the session with Cláudia and Mara. I think that the three papers dialogue perfectly, and now I'm sharing my screen, and we can discuss afterwards. Okay. So can everybody see it? I think
Perfect. Thanks, Raquel.
perfect, because I can't see anyone because I'm recording the session. Well, so let's start. As Hani said, I'm speaking about Rosa Chacel, a writer I've been working on for quite a long time now, and I'm focusing on a more recent research on emotion and the diaries that hopefully will be of the interest of everybody. In 1937, Rosa Chacel fled the Spanish Civil War with her son Carlos and her husband Timoteo Pérez Rubio, who was in charge of preserving the artistic heritage of the Spanish Republic, particularly from the Museo del Prado. In 1940, they left Europe from Bordeaux, embarking on a long exile that took the novelist to Buenos Aires, Nueva York, where she was awarded the Guggenheim Fellowship in 1959, and most notably, Rio de Janeiro. She wouldn't return to Spain until 1974, a year before Franco's death, with the support of a fellowship from the Juan March Foundation that gave her visibility in her own country, where her literary work in exile had remained almost completely unknown during Francoism. In 1982, the publication of the diary she had been keeping since fleeing Spain demonstrated both the renewed interest in her work and the importance that life writing acquired in constructing new forms of collective memory in the early days of Spanish democracy. However, the two volumes, to which in 1998 her son Carlos Chacel, in collaboration with Antonio Piedra, would have a third, weren't received as one might expect for a monumental 900-page work from a writer who was, despite all difficulties, at the pinnacle of her career. In fact, in 1987, she received the National Literary Prize. Many of the reviews published at the time considered the text too egotistical, too inward-looking, and argued that it lacked interest in the life of an exiled writer. For example, in her review of the text in one of the most important literary journals, Insula, Ana Salado noted that the point of view is only that of Rosa Chacel. It is, in effect, an egocentrism that does not attempt to evade or conceal itself. All the translations in the slides are done have been done by me. Salado asserted that the only interest of the 900-page diary was Chacel's genuine personality, but that was it. There was no mention to Chacel's exile, the experience of isolation during the years in Rio, or the difficulties in dealing with publishers in Argentina and afterwards in Spain. Also, no mention to possible connections with other pieces of life writing or to other diaries more specifically. Chacel was thus excluded from being recognized as a representative voice of Spanish cultural exile, as her testimony was not considered valuable for those seeking to delve into diasporic trauma. However, the most aggressive response came by mail. Javier Marías, a young novelist who would soon become a canonical writer, dismissed the volume in very similar terms to Salado's, highlighting an egocentrism manifested in Chacel's constant complaints throughout the diary, which he linked to a form of feminine life writing. And I'm reading this fragment in Spanish for clarity. La queja, the complaint, me ha parecido siempre algo consustancial a la mujer, algo irremediable e inherente. Casi te diría que la forma femenina de expresión par excellence. La queja y no la oposición, el lamento y no la cólera, la crítica y no el intento de imponerse a las conductas criticadas, siempre esperando que la solución venga de fuera, esperando siempre el regalo merecido, pues la mujer, con frecuencia, tiene la actitud implícita en la misma queja de merecer. The letter was published during the life of Rosa Chacel in an edited volume, in a volume of her letters that Ana Rodriguez Fisher publishes in 1992. So I kind of think of these volumes as a sort of a revenge, but this is a bit risky to say. In any way. Marias differentiates between feminine and masculine emotions. He focused on the sentimental aspects of the diary rather than the important contributions made by Chacel throughout these pages. For example, the reflections on diary writing itself, her sophisticated understanding of life writing, an approach that Chacel had developed early on through her readings of the French author André Gide, among others. For Marias, the difference also lay in the nuances between egocentrism and narcissism. Let's see. Aquí says, ¿por qué, si no, ese gusto por la minucia y el detalle, por la opinión ajena? Es decir, ¿por qué esa servidumbre a la coquetería? Digo coquetería muy conscientemente, pues lo que hay en los diarios es eso, más que narcisismo. Narciso es un mito masculino. No conozco ninguna mujer narcisa. El narciso necesita poco de la confirmación exterior, casi no depende de otros. Es más soberbio que vanidoso. Las mujeres, tú incluida, suelen ser más vanidosas, por el contrario, que soberbias. The obvious conclusion from these lines is the misogynistic perception of the Chacel's diary by Javier Marías, but what's subtler is the isolation of Chacel's diaries from the politics of memory that were just beginning to take shape in democratic Spain. I'll come back to the problem of narcissism in a moment. Both testimonies, Salados and Marías' ones, highlight the need to read collective identity within individual narratives. If Salados' review leaves us questioning what this corpus can do for Spain's cultural memory, Maria's letter offers an understanding of the literary nation that's male-centered and where feminine elements have to be suppressed. My questions are, what did Rosa Chacel complain about? And second, can we reinsert her work into an ethics of diary keeping, having considered these two reviews? I'm addressing these questions by considering the relationship between narcissism and vulnerability as a result of emotional responses that shape a very particular ethics of diary keeping. I use the term narcissism despite Maria's rejection of it because it involves engaging with one's own reflection, an attitude Marias denies Chacel with all its repercussions from a gender and from a genre perspective. Narcissism, and not just coquetry, as he expresses, emerges in these diaries from the feeling of isolation from one's community of origin and the need to find empathy through the readership of the diaries. So what did Rosa Chacel complain about? She complained about her physical presence. She repeats throughout her diaries that she has to lose weight, that her clothing is not appropriate for the social events she has to attend, which leads us to the second topic of her complaint, money, the lack of opportunities to live in decent conditions, and lastly, in general, I say the complaint emerges from this feeling of isolation in the social milieu and the literary field. But I think that by including these aspects in her diary, Chacel was presenting a vulnerable self that had nothing to do with traditional self-narratives of exile, and that's the problem in the reception. Chacel's recounting of exile isn't one of self-improvement and glory, but a process of exploring failure, as he proposed in the first diary entry written while awaiting to leave France. She says, en este cuaderno estudiaré los progresos que hacen en mí la idea de fracaso. Cada día estoy más familiarizada con ella. ¿Por qué de pronto escribo esto? No lo sé. Si a mí misma no me importa, ¿a quién puede importarlo? ¿No? If it doesn't matter to me, why should it matter to anyone? Despite her complaints, from the very first entry of her diary, from this sentence in particular, Chacel includes the other as part of her own life writing. She questions both herself and her future readers. Why should it matter to anyone? Why should it matter even for herself, this experience? A question that remains central in contemporary and 21st century life writing. And in fact, through her diary, she answered my second question. Can we reinsert her work into an ethics of diary keeping? Why should this complaint matter to us? In an interview with Milagros Sánchez Arnosi following the publication of Alcancía in 1982, Rosa Chacel insisted on this issue, stating that one also writes a diary as it includes the life of all of others, their warriors, their suffering. She responds that porque las cosas que pasan en mi vida no están hechas exclusivamente por mí, se relacionan con la vida del prójimo, tanto con la del que me es muy próximo como la del lejano. Las cosas de mi vida se interrelacionan con la vida de los otros. In this fragment, Chacel directs to the meaning of reading itself. Texts can move their interpreters, and writing plays a fundamental role in establishing communities of shared feeling. In some ways, Chacel anticipated a vision of the ethics of autobiography later developed by Ángel Loureiro in a groundbreaking work in which, following Emmanuel Levinas, he argued that life writing is inherently a collective task because it involves exposing oneself, including one's faults and complaints, to others. In his work, Loureiro does not address Chacel's diaries, but he examines a body of memoirs from the Spanish Republican exile and argues that autobiographical writings are accountable to another who, although they might be implicit, invisible, unrecognized, or even denied by the autobiographer, leaves another who that leaves an unmistakable mark on the composition, language, and themes of autobiographical writings. This fact already situates autobiography and life writing within the realm of the collective and allows for a reconsideration of vulnerability as a crucial element in forging bonds with the broader community. As I suggested earlier, Chacel anticipated this perspective both in her diaries and in her essay on life writing, La Confession, published in 1971. First, in an entry from 1970, she presents a strikingly similar view to Loureiro's. ¿Qué objeto tiene quejarme? Dejar aquí constancia del horror de mi vida si nadie puede consolarme. Siempre me interesó encontrar a alguien que me compadeciese y estoy segura de que estos cuadernos lo encontrarán algún día. Es posible que lo único positivo sea esa compasión que tal vez despierte en alguien. Written in 1970, this passage already suggests that her complaints serve an essential purpose: to elicit a response from the reader and to foster empathy. From this perspective, her diaries are clearly part of an ethical project, one that was not understood at the time of the publication of the diaries, and it's very surprising to see that she already is talking about the complaint, and we see through this passage that how Javier Marias didn't understand well the meaning of the complaint. Second, so first in her diaries, second in her essay, the confession, she further defends this idea, stating that we narrate, relive, and recreate for the other what that person have not experienced, what have not existed for them. The expression of vulnerability that arises from seeing oneself in a mirror is valuable. It enables a deeper engagement with different realities and a greater understanding of the complexities of emotional structures. There is also here a poetics of relationality, as we saw last week with Sibila Leramo and Maria Zambrano. Chacel offers insight into exile, not merely by describing her precarious situation, but through the intricate nature of the diary itself, in which she engages with topics as complex in literary theory as readership, reception, and empathy, and reading how reading can promote empathy. In this sense, her diary proposes a new understanding of the collective significance of diary keeping, which is crucial for grasping the complexity of the forms, fragments, and fractures of contemporary life writing. And that's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Raquel, for another fantastic paper. Again, I think your elaboration of narcissism as of vulnerability is so exciting in the context of the broader discussions we're having, and your whole paper is a really compelling new angle on Chacel's work. So thank you very much for that. A huge thank you to all three of our speakers for really compelling, beautifully developed papers. We are so grateful to have heard your work today. And I'd like to open up now to the floor to see if anyone has any questions, either for all of our speakers or for one in particular. Otherwise, I can start us off if there are no burning questions as yet. So I thought the papers spoke really, really well to one another. And one of the things I was very struck by were the dynamics of self-concealment and self-revelation and how they were working across the different women writers and across the different contexts that you were discussing. And I thought that Cláudia's idea of this precarious balancing act was really interesting in terms of whether this is something particular to women's writing, whether it's something that's specifically related to particular forms of women's writing. And I wondered if each of you could tell us a bit more about this balance between self-concealment, self-revelation, and questions of narrative power. So I suppose, I'm sorry to have gone about this in a long way, but my question is, do these examples of women's writing take their charge from this balance between self-concealment and self-exposure? I feel like, Raquel, you might have quite a different answer, at least with respect to this work in Chacel's oeuvre, but potentially a different one elsewhere. So I'll hand over to whoever would like to speak first. Great. Cláudia?
I just want to say that, I haven't conjured up this concept out of thin air.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a concept being developed by my colleague Elena at the University of Barcelona, as I said on the first. So that's the thing. I couldn't quote her more because it's still being developed, but she did sort of do a paper on that in a 19th century context. But I think what is really fascinating is that it started off as a 19th century concept, but it is applicable I believe, certainly during the dictatorship period. And it may well be that the diary is precisely, and life writing generally, enables more revelation. But I think that there's still these various layers. And I think the layers for me are to do with the target audience. And I think the most, it's the voice of the inner critic that's the most difficult to satisfy. And certainly what I see is that you can do quite a lot of self-revelation to others, but to yourself, there's certain things that may or may not be more difficult. And I think it is a process of exploration. So where I see, the balancing act is the courage to go on exploring. And I was really fascinated by Raquel's paper about, the aspect of failure and the complaint, which speaks straight back, in fact, to Irene Lisboa, who starts her diary, Solitude, saying, eu quero lamentar-me, I want to complain. I'm claiming the right to complain. I thought that was really fascinating.
Fantastic. Thank you, Cláudia. Mara, Raquel?
Yeah, I can jump in if you like. So thank you very much for the question, Hani. I think it was particularly interesting. So among the corpus that I've been analyzing, and I have more or less 45, 50 texts now. Well, there is no only autobiographical writing per se, but we have diaries in its core form, as well novels and so on and so forth. What is interesting, I think, is that this balance between self-concealment and self-revelation is either extremely explicit in novels, in the re-elaboration, therefore, of traumas coming from the war in fictional characters, or instead in diaristic writing. When we find this in diaristic writing, there is literally like, in the printed one, a change of the oh God, the word is missing. So it's in italics. Help me with that. And therefore we can really see whether the author is the point of view is from her real identity, if you see what I mean, or from this new identity that the author has to take on in order to survive in hiding. And there is indeed a kind of a sort of a different approach to life and an evolution towards this new identity that is very much unsettling at the beginning, and little by little you can really perceive how the author really see that as the only way to survive. So there is a kind of a process of exploration of the self, like the previous self, the real self, and an exploration of this new self, of new emotion and new experiences of the war through this self.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Mara. And Raquel, where does Chacel sit on this spectrum?
Thank you very much. Well, Cláudia, from the start, I thought that Una Portuguesa in Paris, it was strikingly similar to, it would be awesome to do a comparison between this work and Chacel's diaries, because Chacel also travels to Paris at the moment. Well, it's interesting because she does a trip to Paris before her exile and does a second trip afterwards. I think in 1959 or 1960, when she has some money from the Guggenheim Fellowship that allows her to travel, and the vision is very interesting. The vision from a writer that has been secluded in Rio, and well, Spanish and Portuguese are very similar, but for her the language barrier was an important one. So well, I'm going to give my question to answer Hani's question, but I'd also like to connect this aspect of balancing act of life writing as a balancing act with the spatiality that was very important in your papers. And well, with in relationship with Hani's question, and we can then delve into this question of spatiality. I think that we have to have two aspects in mind. The first one is the types of life writing, the genres, if we can say so. So it's very different how one balances its the personality through a diary than through, in a memoir or in autobiography. And the other thing, and I'm going to mention something that I didn't mention in my talk, is and it's related to the problem of genre, is the publication, which Mara already mentioned something about this. For example, Rosa Chacel, very early, she starts thinking about publishing her diary, because she has all these European, the male European writers like André Gide, Baudelaire, afterwards Pavese. Also bear in mind that the French model is always serving as a reference, but it's very different. It's very different how she presents herself through this complaint in the 2 volumes that were published before knowing how the diaries were going to be received, and the 3rd volume, which she writes her this 3rd volume after the publication of the Alcancía Ida and Alcancía Vuelta. And in this case, she takes total control of her image, of the image she presents, because she's aware of how the other 2 have been received. So I'm also working through these nuances between these nuances among the different volumes of and that's all, and only right. And that's it. If you want to, we can talk about speciality, or we can ask see if anybody has any other questions.
Brilliant. Thank you, Raquel. Let's definitely save time to talk about spatiality. I think we have a question from Jean. Jean, do you want to?
Yeah, thank you. Well, first, to thank Cláudia and Mara and Raquel for such excellent and inspiring papers. And I would like to ask a question to Raquel about the title, the titles of Chacel's diaries. What can you tell us about Alcancía Ida, Alcancía Vuelta?
Yes, thank you, John. Well, Alcancía is not a very, it's not a very common word in Spanish, and it means like, it's like a money box. So where you put your savings, which is for starters very symbolic of Chacel's complaints. And she explains in the presentation in the prologue to her diaries that she has chosen this word first for the sound of it, Alcancía, for this power to evocate something that is remote, because it's also a word that is not very common in the most part of Spain. And then the subtitle, Alcancía Ida, Alcancía Vuelta, it makes a connection with her first novel, Estación, Ida y Vuelta, which is a very experimental novel from 1930. Very bad understood novel, I think. We should go back into it. So yeah, from the paratext, she is establishing a connection between style first, the sound of Alcancía, such a nice word. Strangeness, because it's a strange word for Spaniards. I think the most Spanish speakers won't recognize this word even nowadays. And yeah, Sean, sorry.
No, I was thinking that is because if the Arabic origins, I think in Andalusia is used a little bit.
Yeah.
The rest of Spain, I think, is ucha, as you say. Any Spaniard would recognize ucha, but Alcancía, only a few.
Yeah,
But it is interesting for what you say, the strangeness.
Yeah, and that's and the third thing is the connection she establishes between her fiction, Ida y Vuelta, Estación, Ida y Vuelta, Alcancía, Ida y Vuelta, and her life writing. And this is very interesting with regards with the theory of life writing that Chacel is contributing to. So yeah,
I think.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt.
No.
But I think what you say that it means that ucha to collect the money has an intrinsic idea of futurity,
Yeah.
which you have mentioned, the idea of saving money for the future. And I was wondering if this sort of ingrained or implicit futurity in the title is already making a difference between the diary, which is a present, and life writing, which has this sense of the future implicit or in a way there because is for the future. And I was wondering, because you made this connection, in fact, whether already in the title is conveyed, only for a few that understand the word, obviously. But this sort of strangeness also draws attention to the word, because why not call them diarios ida, diarios vuelta, like sort of so many? And that was my question and my commentary on the question.
Brilliant.
But
no, thank you very much, Sean. Just quickly, because I think this idea there of this future with regards to the term Alcancía is very pertinent. It's very pertinent, and I think it should make us reflect on the complex of the temporal complexity of the diary. The diary is not as easy as writing an entry each day. It's a project of the future, and it's very different from memoir tend to be in the past. So yeah, thank you very much because it's very pertinent.
Yes, thank you, Jean, for an excellent question. I completely agree about the temporality. I think Lorraine, do you have a question?
Yes, I do. Thanks, Honey. I have a question for Raquel, and thank you for your stellar paper, which I really enjoyed. I just wanted to ask you about self-diary in the context of like performance theory. If you consider work like kind of Salmon and Law testimony and so on, that life writing can be a form of actually resolving and overcoming trauma. So I suppose that would be kind of would dovetail with modern approaches like spiritual therapy, for example. And do you think that it was a kind of a cathartic act for her that ultimately helped her personally to come to terms with the trauma of exile and the inevitable isolation that she suffered during her life?
Thank you, Lorraine. I couldn't hear you very well. I don't know if it's my internet, but the main question is
I can repeat.
The trauma and diary keeping, right?
Yes, yeah, that's it. Like, would it be? Was it a personal form of catharsis for her? In the way we'd understand it nowadays, as spiritual therapy. I suppose, I have a recent interest in mental health, in the humanities. So it could be completely off tangent, but I would be interested to know, and obviously you're very conversant with the archives. Do you think it could correspond to that?
Yeah, no, I think so. That's very pertinent. And while studying diaries, myself, while studying these diaries from a period that's away from us and from experience that is very very remote to us, I can't think. I think about the connections with contemporaries diary keeping, 21st century diary keeping, and how diary keeping is being promoted through social media, through newspapers, through periodicals, especially after COVID. There's a rise of mental health awareness, and particularly this awareness connected with the form of the diary. I'm very interested in exploring how the diary is a form of life writing that's more suitable for the expression of trauma, because it's apparently disorganized, because it's apparently incoherent, and that makes it more appropriate for expressing the experience of trauma. And in fact, it's very surprising that Rosa Chacel, but also other Spanish authors as Max Au start to write their diaries only when their exile begins. And it's true that afterwards Rosa Chacel starts reading like a crazy woman about everything she can read about diaries. She reads every diary she can grasp from the European tradition, but that comes afterwards. The possibility of establishing a dialogue with the tradition established in France, not that established in Spain, comes after it begins as the diary begins as an expression of trauma. So your question is again completely pertinent. Thank you.
Thanks for that. Really interesting. Adding to my own knowledge of the mental health humanities as well. Thanks, Raquel.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Lorraine. And Ursula, you have a question.
I do have lots of questions, but I can see very little time to ask, so I'm just going to be as concise as I can. Thank you all so much for 3 really fabulous papers. I enjoyed every single one of them. They were great, and they spoke to each other, I think, really nicely. And I just think that those questions around spatiality and temporality that keep coming up across the papers are really worth investigating further and taking further in future discussions as well. I had a particular question for Mara, and I was thinking about domesticity. I was thinking about home, and I was thinking about the different homes in which your subjects find themselves, and in which they find themselves recreating themselves and recreating new identities and so on. And I'm not familiar with all of the texts. So I was wondering if I could ask you around, let's say, the very early conceptions of home that we meet in these texts, which they may differ, obviously, one from another. But I'm wondering if the earliest definitions, formulations, representations of home are always positive, and if all of the other homes then are constructed negatively, or if that's not quite the case, if there are differences between the early home and the later homes. Is the early home ever problematized, I suppose, really is the nub of what I'm getting at.
Right. Thank you very much, Ursula. Yeah, well, so the point is that social class of the author that I have published and can be included in this category of new Holocaust literature reporting, right? This experience of hiding comes really from like a bourgeoisie class, which was quite common for the Italian Jews in the 30s. So the majority of books published that we have about that is really about author who had this idea of a settled and pacific and very much integrated family life within within the rest of the society, which is another crucial point. So the exclusion from that very secure and protected family life really collapse when there is the promulgation of the Russia laws and later on with persecution. So on the one hand, we really have this sort of the sense of protection that really collapse in the following fortuitous dwellings. It is true, though, that there are some books that have been let's say, written by putting together either letters or unpublished diaries. These books were mostly published by historians. I'm thinking about Anna Foa or Ossi Guerrazzi. And in these books, that rewrites mostly experiences of people living in the Jewish ghetto or the former Jewish ghetto, where the idea of home was very much different from the idea of home, for instance, for Lia Levi in Turin and then in Rome and so on and so forth. That changes indeed. And there is a kind of a sort of a liberation when either the author or even more the children happen to be moved in the countryside. And so there are new places and new spaces that really change their ideas of what was home before and what home could actually mean in the sense. So yeah, thank you for the question.
Thank you. That's really interesting. Thanks, Mara.
Agreed. And I actually think it speaks really well to Claudia's paper. If we could end by handing back to Cláudia and just asking Cláudia if you could pick up on those dynamics of temporality and spatiality. You did already in your paper, but I wonder, could you build on them with respect to the travel writing side of things?
Well, that's a challenge. Topic. Small topic. Yes, I think beginning with the speciality, I mean, obviously that's the most obvious one because it's on one level it's geographical, but on another one it's mental. And I did wonder when I was writing this paper whether I should actually go into nomadic identities, into Bredotti. A former graduate student, Rosa Clark, has done that in connection with the life writing of Ilse Lose, and I think it's that would be very interesting to do. The other thing, of course, is I'm just sort of brainstorming, but is the life writing, the diary format, and the pen and paper, that in itself is a home for the writer, and I think that could be interesting to explore as well, and also in connection with any archival documentation, but that's a different take. As for temporality, I see it more in terms of genealogy, because I think this is a point that was just being made at some of these women writers, and the case of Natalia Nunes is certainly one of them. She references other diarists. In her case, she's referencing the diaries of Kafka and how she's going to actually get the money to purchase them. So aware that there is around them a tradition with different configurations, and that they're adding to the tradition, and also I think altering it, and in many cases I suspect adding the dimension of gender. So I mean, obviously in Natalia Nunes' case, she already had Irene Lisboa as a predecessor, but I think it's interesting to look at these genealogies when you talk about temporality and the sort of past, present, and future, because essentially I suspect that they're also thinking about their readership, and whether it's a gendered one or whether, like has already been said, it's something that is to do with reacting to critics and to criticism, would be interesting to investigate further.
Absolutely. That at least it certainly does, Cláudia, after me having thrown a giant question at you. I thought you answered that beautifully and introduced yet another key theme that's come up through all of our papers. I think that question of genealogy and network, and hopefully we'll have time in future sessions to explore that in more detail. And I think all that remains is for us to thank profoundly our three speakers for fantastic papers, and also to thank all of you very much for being here. We hope to see you again next week at the same time, and many, many thanks to Cláudia, to Mara, and to Raquel once again. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much again.
Really great.
Bye.
Thank you.